Welcome back to the day 3 of the TIEMS 2022 annual conference. I'm very pleased next to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Stern. Dr. Stern is currently superintendent of the Emergency Management Institute in Emmitsburg, Maryland. He previously led the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, where he was responsible for disaster and homeland security preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery efforts across the Commonwealth. Dr. Stern has served for more than 3 decades as an emergency manager, serving in local, state, and federal government positions in the private sector, in academia, including several U.S. presidential appointments. Dr. Stern, it's great to see you again. I see you're bearded this time. Looks great. So welcome. The floor is yours.
Good to be with everybody from, I'm assuming, both in Atlanta and around the world. My sincere apologies for not being able to be with you all in person, but the pace in the last few weeks at the Federal Emergency Management Agency has picked up as emergency management professionals and educators, researchers, colleagues. It's always amazing that our associations always like to put the meetings right in the middle of the peak of hurricane season. So, but I'm glad with technology that we can be together. I want to share a few things with you about what we're doing at the Emergency Management Institute in order to support professional development for emergency managers in the United States, and hopefully beginning to do some joint partnerships with folks to develop the profession around the world. But I want to start out with talking about sort of the field and how we fit or don't fit together, should fit together with some other sort of, call it professional policy spheres, professional groupings that are traditional. I want to talk about our field as we try to make it more of a profession. I know that's been a longstanding academic point of discourse. And then I want to talk, and I will share with you our specific plans at the Emergency Management Institute, which are very exciting over the next couple of years. And then hopefully I'll leave a little bit of time for some Q&A before the top of the hour. So diving right in, I want you all to sort of imagine a suite of Venn diagrams, the sort of circles that if you're an academic, you have to do a theory, and it's got to either be a Venn diagram or it's got to be, in sort of a 4-square box, right? So let's take the Venn diagram approach. Traditionally, we have sort of defined and separated out our circle of emergency management, our sphere, which was originally the roots, at least in the United States, were part of the national security sphere. Our roots in World War II with the first White House Office of Emergency Management, really heavily focused on resource allocation. And so those spheres were overlapped, but have become specifically separated, especially in the last 40 years as sort of emergency management emerged in its modern all hazard sort of approach, distinct from the early origins in civil defense that came about after World War II and then Cold War. So I want you to imagine the two circles: national security and emergency management. The national security world, you could trace its sort of intellectual underpinnings back to a few hundred years of diplomacy. There are many sort of advanced schools where people in the national security world go to train, whether it be a civilian going to, the Harvards or Oxfords or Cambridges, or in the military in the United States, at least, to any of the military war colleges or defense universities. And we have a whole population of decades, at least in the United States, of both Democratic and Republican strategists and operators in the national security profession. EMI actually was started 71 years ago as the Civil Defense Staff College. And when FEMA was created in 1979, that's when we saw that separation. And so emergency management came about as much more of a sort of technical field. EMI, in fact, when we were rebranded from the Staff College and became the Institute, really focused on delivering technical training, almost quasi vocational training, how to write a better plan, how to run an emergency operations center, how to do some risk analysis and risk assessment, but very much training folks at sort of the entry level or mid level to do technical functions. Whereas that national security group continued to think about strategy, doctrine, policy, diplomacy, use of force. As what's the class who said war is. I'm going to get this wrong, but diplomacy by other means or something like that. Somebody will know and put in the chat room the right quote there. So we saw this separation in the last 40 years. And there's another sort of a third Venn diagram, which is the deep-rooted sort of disaster, I'll call it sciences, building engineering, the built environment, and a lot of disaster research and sociological studies. You could divide those up, but let's just put that in a group of grounded sort of academic theory underpinning that while there was some overlap in the Venn diagram with what we did in emergency management probably earlier, gradually again separated out. So we now have three circles: national security, emergency management, sort of the disaster sciences, engineering, social sciences. Now, 21 years ago in the United States, we had this focusing event, this policy shock, 9/11. Out of that created the Homeland Security Circle. And I would proffer, and some of you were around, and I was certainly around at the time, that because emergency management had become so technically oriented in our thinking, because we had failed to sort of evolve in a similar sort of parallel structure, and it separated from that national security space, a lot of national security personnel saw an opportunity. So we created another circle. We now have a fourth, Homeland Security. And with that created over, the last 20 years, I think there's over 400 Homeland Security academic programs. You could have subsets of Homeland Security now, and the emergence of cybersecurity over the last decade as a sort of a discipline. And then I would say, while we talked about 9/11, sort of adopting from the British the term resilience, and sort of, when I say adopt from the British, going back to the Churchill, sort of keep calm and carry on. And I think in the President George W. Bush administration, we started using around Homeland Security the term resilience in that regard. About, I would say, 10, 12 years ago, resilience itself became much more of a focus related to activities around climate change and hazard mitigation. And resilience itself separated from what would have been an outcome of sort of comprehensive emergency management, planning, organizing, equipping, training, exercising, finding and recovering activities. And many remember may have been part of funding one seats initiative. Again, that was about a decade ago. $1 million to 100 cities around the globe to do resilience activities and embed a sort of resilience subject matter as an executive embedded directly with the mayor or a governor or a regional cover emergency management worlds. They were adept at being strategic and getting partners in play. So here we are. We have three academic roots, Homeland Security, and resilience function. All to the detriment, I would say, of the emergency management community that we've seen over the last years is very out of complex. So we're seeing increasingly from the large number of hurricanes, for example, in the United States, we're seeing now additional challenges on emergency managers in the United States, very involved in coordinating or leading or working closely with public health emergency preparedness, another discipline unto itself through COVID. In some cases in the United States, emergency managers get involved at the local level in state level and lead task forces to reduce the scourge of opioids in the United States, which are claiming about 100,000 lives a year. In some cities like Los Angeles, emergency managers getting involved in trying to address the wicked problem of homelessness as well. At federal level, so it's a staff and FEMA organization that helped lead Operation Allies Welcome. So bring back the roughly 80 to 100,000 Afghan refugees who were able to be removed last year. We've seen FEMA staff lead both the vaccination rollout for COVID as well as now FEMA staffers leading the monkeypox program. So we're getting into a lot of non-traditional missions. Yet the roots academically still are sort of that separate circle. It's very technical and vocational. And it's really time that I think we, and obviously in Europe, dealing with millions of refugees in Ukraine, shifts of population all over the displaced populations now at any point since World War II. I think I remember hearing that last year. And so as emergency management, I think it's time for us as leaders, thinkers, the field, the graybeards, and this is an experiment from last month, but sort of I think it's time we get some gray beards and silver-haired thinkers, in sort of that traditional national security sense, to think about what can we do for professional development to not abandon all that technical training and education, but to really realign, to overlap those Venn diagrams so that we are at the table during the national security discussions, during the homeland security discussions, during the strategic initiatives related to resilience, that it doesn't become some separate activity, but becomes an outcome of all these efforts, decades and decades of engineering, science and sociology that is related to disaster research. So in my view, we're sort of back to that role we were at the very beginnings of emergency management, at the beginning, whether it be World War II or the Cold War, where we were part of that national security function. And in fact, in the federal government of the United States, emergency management is back at the table. I sit on a newly created consortium of institutions created by the White House National Security Council. It's called the National Security Education Consortium. And I, as the superintendent of EMI, represent the Department of Homeland Security, along with the superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy. And then the other members of the consortium are the superintendents of the military colleges, West Point, the Naval Academy, the Coast Air Force Academy, and then all the presidents of all our various war colleges, universities in the United States. And so, again, we're at the table, and increasingly the military strategists and national security strategists are starting to realize that it's hard to draw a distinction in the United States, which we've been able to do, between a sort of national and international security and global affairs and domestic or internal homeland security. The cyberspace doesn't have borders. Biological agents or diseases like COVID or Ebola don't have borders. Misinformation and the social media landscape doesn't have borders. Global supply chains, as intertwined as they become in the last 3 decades, one disruption and one nation leads to disruptions. Others, these become emergency management problems when the systems that support society fail, whether it be energy security, as we're seeing with the global dance with recession, and then the vulnerable populations that we have in the United States and around the world who need help more than ever. So I think it's important that we begin to at least expand that emergency management circle to overlap and touch all those other parts of that Venn diagram. This will support, I think, importantly, the continued progression of the emergency management field. And I use that word specifically more towards a profession. And there are many colleagues who will take umbrage to saying that, we're not a profession. I'm not saying we're not professional, but emergency management has operated with very porous barriers to entry. All of us have come, for the most part, from different backgrounds to this interesting field. In the operations practitioners, it's very much been a on-the-job training. Choose your own adventure. Take one of the 362 classes that Emergency Management Institute operates on sort of their own, and hopefully, come up with some semblance of professional development. We've seen in the United States the gradual sort of trying to coalesce knowledge. Originally, we called it the Advanced Professional Series. Again, a choose your own adventure. The emergency management associations have built the Certified Emergency Manager program. That's through the International Association of Emergency Managers. That's about 25 years old. But again, you self-design across 10 or 12 different categories, things between your education, your experience, your disaster work, that go before a council to sort of say, okay, you've, like in a trade craft, reached some sort of level. And then we've, at least about the last 12 years, have tried to sort of add to all of that an academy model for the practitioners, a sort of basic academy of about 160 hours of common knowledge, and advanced academy of another 4 weeks. That does start to get into some strategic thinking and leadership, and then executive academy that we run a few times a year. And we've had several thousand people complete all of that, but the throughput is not where it needs to be over the last decade. And so, if you have a porous barrier to entry, anybody can choose their own adventure. People generally join as a specialist when they join an emergency management agency, or they have their own expertise. And then we try to create generalists. It's not sort of a surprise that the field is a little more loose to define when you compare it to other strong, what we would consider and call professions. Think about medicine, law, diplomacy, again, as we alluded to earlier, any of the sort of sciences, engineering, all of those. You start out as a generalist, you get common knowledge, and then you become a specialist and an expert. In other professions, there are barriers to entry. You typically start at the bottom and work your way up. At least in the United States, somebody can join FEMA from the most entry level position to the administrator without common set of characteristics that would, make them whatever we want to perceive a rounded body of knowledge emergency manager could be. And so I think it's very important that we begin to flip that, to create like a profession, a way to join in as a generalist with common knowledge, and move forward on the pathway to more professional development. And so what we're doing to help build that and underpin that, help place us sort of at the table with the right background, tools, resources, intellectual underpinnings to sit with leaders, whether it be from the national security world, the private sector, to have the confidence of the C-suite executives, the CEOs that we might need to advise if you're in the private sector, emergency management, the mayors and presidents in the public sector, at least in the United States, the nonprofit group vice presidents and presidents and leaders, and to bring that complex system together. We're embarking this coming year on a plan at EMI that we call EMI Anywhere. And sort of the notional design and example, the idea that the motto we use is that Any of our programs need to be available to any emergency manager, anywhere they are, anytime in their career on any platform. Right now, we have about 200 programs that are online, 211 online independent study classes. Many of you have probably taken your own programs. Anybody around the world can take them. They're not limited to U.S. Citizens. And then we have about 150 some classes that are in person, either delivered on our campus in Emmitsburg, Maryland, which we can seat about 4,000 to 5,000 people a year at, or through what we call mobile deliveries. We'll deliver programs around the United States and do about another 10,000 to 14,000 people a year in person. Sometimes our programs are delivered by state training partners or others, but we need to really expand that throughput. And so Emmitsburg can be a hard place to get to for those in-person classes, and we can't deprive. There's an equity challenge and a problem that's very important for this administration and for us to think about. If we want to diversify and have the best people, we can't make it hard for people to get their initial training. We can't make it hard for people to get their professional development training. And I often use the example of the Kodiak, Alaska emergency manager that may never get to EMI, or maybe only come once in their career just because it's a long distance away, or maybe they have spouse or other care issues, or their town manager says you're not going to go. Now, I use that example at EMI in a class when I was having this discussion, and Kodiak, Alaska guy raised his hand in the background and said, I'm a Kodiak, Alaska emergency manager. So probably need to find maybe somebody more remote. But the fact is, if we're going to support the profession and EMI as an institute, we have at our peak during COVID 2001, we had 934,000 students take 2.4 million courses. We average between 800 and 900,000 people a year taking classes. There's obviously a huge demand and a need, and those are emergency managers, those are law enforcement personnel, firefighters, Department of Defense personnel, those are academics. So again, EMI Anywhere, let's make all of our stuff available. And so we have a 6-point plan to do this and to help transform how we do business, do things forward. I'll just zip through these real quickly, and then I'll pop over to the chat, see if there's questions. First, we're hoping to modernize our eCampus tools and technologies so that we can have these sort of interactions online in a way that is expected of adult education. Right now, as you can imagine, we're the United States government, we're a corner of it that has very clunky older technology. And so we need to up our game. And we also need to learn how to do the presentations online better. Secondly, we have a plan to build satellite campuses across the United States, at least one in each FEMA region, in partnership with the FEMA regions, colleges, universities, and other private sector partners. And we're mapping that out. We're currently revising, going through to see how we can streamline our curriculum of those 362 plus classes, and we're always adding or dropping stuff. What we want to do is, again, looking at that profession, make it much easier to identify where you start. So let's put the foundational classes together and then begin to build mid and advanced career tracks. And our goal is to actually build certificate-based programs in areas where we feel there are knowledge gaps in emergency management. And so this year we'll be working on a certificate program that we hope to deliver in 2024. We'll build it in 2023 on climate adaptation and hazard mitigation. We hope to build a certificate program for equity and socioeconomic vulnerability also, and then deliver in 24. And in 24, we'll build programs for disaster logistics and supply chain management, disaster law and policy, disaster project management, disaster finance and grants management, and several others. And so hopefully we'll build 2 or 3 a year, and then begin to roll them out and deliver them either at EMI or through the partner universities, part of the higher education system in the United States. I really don't care who's delivering the content. We want to get a touch on, and begin to move from what we traditionally call our master practitioner programs, which we have at EMI. Again, the nomenclature, a vestige of on-the-job training, this being more of a trade craft, and evolve them towards more of an academic adult learning certificate that would be more comporting with how other professions do their professional development, executive development. So eCampus, satellite campuses, revised curriculum. The next couple of things I hope would intrigue you, and hope some of you could be part of it at some point. Fourth, as part of looking back, and again, those Venn diagrams and thinking about our evolution as a field to a profession, and that separation of emergency management from national security and those other sort of call them strategy, policy, doctrine fields. We have lacked, I think, when there are incidents for the field. We have great practitioners, interested policymakers, disaster researchers, and disaster educators, and it's sort of been in four corners. And so we're going through a process right now to figure out how, like a military war college or a think tank, we could serve as a catalyst to bring those four groups together to think about what are the top issues in the field of emergency management on sort of an annualized basis. What are the key lessons observed and how can we get them to be learned? What are the top areas that are ripe for disaster research? And what are the sort of top policy initiatives so that we can begin to drive law, strategy, and doctrine and serve the same role that the military war colleges do, or some of the think tanks, and begin to let the great ideas, the best thinking from, again, the practitioners, the policymakers, the educators, and the researchers come together. And I think EMI can play a role in that. Fifth, create a new executive crisis leadership fellowship program. We're calling it the Vanguard program. It'll be formally announced by the FEMA administrator in the next few months. But we've run 2 pilots, and what we've done there is, for the first time, we've created a space where we're bringing the senior most leaders at the federal, state, local, tribal, territorial level, nonprofit, and private sector groups together in a cohort to purposely network ahead of the wicked problem disaster, to understand each other's roles, responsibilities, and authorities, to understand some disaster theory. So we're working with both Harvard, the RAND Corporation, and the McChrystal Group. For those of you that are familiar with meta leadership out of Harvard, that group, and General Stan McChrystal, his team of teams concept, how you build agile organizations. And we've had a successful couple of pilots of that. It really seems to be hitting a nerve we've never had in the emergency management profession, where we bring senior leaders together ahead of the incident. And they change a lot. And lastly, the sixth thing is to do this next year. EMI will transform, hopefully, into the National Emergency Management College, back to a sort of war college footing, to bring back education and strategy to go alongside the technical training that we've done really well. And so within that college model, the EMI brand will continue to exist, but we'll focus on that entry-level foundational training. We're going to build a school for disaster leadership, focusing on mid and advanced career tracks, and a school for national resilience, focusing on the non-emergency managers. In emergency management, we've used the term whole community for a little over a decade. Well, to separate the emergency managers, we're going to focus on the rest of the community there with specific programs. So, and a lot of other exciting things. So we've got Congress ever signs a budget, our most significant increase in a long time, to carry this out. And we're looking forward to engaging a lot more. I see I'm 3 minutes to the top of the hour. So let's go into the chat room and see if anybody has any questions, or Tom, if you want to facilitate any questions from anybody else, I'm happy to.
I don't see any questions in the chat room, but I have a question for you. Dr. Stern, do you think it's time for standards in EM program design and content? A minimum number of credits in core EM instruction, for example? What organization should be assessing and accrediting?
Yeah, it's a great question there. And that's why there was an earlier question. Yeah, I'm happy to explore a more formalized MOU or partnership with you all. So for EM program design, let's talk about, there's the technical training programs that we run. There's a lot of others that's become very balkanized inside FEMA. And so we do have standards for how we do the technical training program. In some ways, that's almost become too onerous for the knowledge. It takes us a year and a half to build a new course, which is crazy. And it's the same problem we've had. There was a National Academy of Public Administration report on FEMA in 1993. And the paragraph on EMI said EMI takes too long to build its classes. So we need to find the right balance of, for technical training, what's the right way to do it that comports with our accreditation models. Many of our classes do get college credit equivalent, versus just how do we get important knowledge out into the field. Now, on the higher education community, there's a higher education program at FEMA. It used to be part of EMI. It's now separate. I believe last I checked, there were like 328 emergency management programs, associates, bachelor's, master's, and PhD, a couple of PhD programs. They have had discussions amongst themselves in that higher ed community for a long time about standards. They do have a model curriculum. And I think last year I had heard, not directly, that like 22 of the programs you're talking about aligning and trying to come up with some sort of accreditation model for those emergency management programs. There's sort of pros and cons of that, right? If you're a 1 or 2 person professor program, and a lot of universities are under pressure, if you have to undertake an accreditation model, that could make you vulnerable. But at the same time, I think the field does need some set standards for the body of knowledge, and I think they will self-guide that. There's been some discussions about whether FEMA should lead that, but I don't think we should be in the regulatory role. And I think in some ways we could stifle that. So I hope that answers the question. What are our plans for international emergency management professionals? So Dr. Gupta, anybody can take our online classes. We do, with some advance notice, allow people, foreign nationals, to come take our in-person classes. There's some security hoops, of course, because we're not part of the Department of Homeland Security to run through. And then the FEMA administrator has asked me to conceive of how that Vanguard Crisis Leadership Fellowship program we built we could build a model internationally for that. And so we're in the planning phases for that, and probably we'll do something in the next calendar year. Again, if our good colleagues on Capitol Hill and the United States Congress can agree to a budget and sign off on that. I'm at 11:01. I probably 1 minute over. Really, had been an honor to speak with you all. I am available at jeff.stern@fema.dhs.gov. jeff.stern@fema.dhs.gov. I'll type it in the chat for everybody, and then turn it over back to you, Tom. But really, it's been a privilege to speak to you. And again, my sincere apologies for those of you down at Kennesaw State that I'm not there in person with you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. We really appreciate your insights. And just one comment I wanted to make. Back in 2015, I hosted a TIEMS conference in Portland, Oregon, and we had a speaker there. Her name was Myrna Lee. And she was, I think, long-time emergency manager in the Oregon community. And it was interesting to hear her talk about the very same problem, professionalizing the profession as being motivation back probably 20, 30 years ago. She was talking. So clearly this is a challenge, and it's access, and maybe as alluded to earlier, accreditation is, how do you establish and maintain the standards? So again, we really appreciate your perspective and your openness to folks contacting you. And thanks again, Jeff.